Hey everyone, tonight we're going to dive into something that completely changes how you think about permanence. Picture the Sahara Desert in your mind for a moment. 3.6 million square miles of sand stretching across North Africa, bigger than the entire United States. Dunes that tower higher than skyscrapers, temperatures that can cook an egg on a rock, nights so cold they'll freeze water solid. It's the largest hot desert on Earth, a place so hostile that crossing it has challenged explorers for thousands of years. Most of us think of the Sahara as eternal, unchanging. Sand as far as the eye can see, scattered oases like tiny islands in an ocean of emptiness. When you look at satellite images, it seems like the very definition of lifelessness. Endless beige stretching to the horizon, broken only by the occasional rocky outcrop or the thin green line of the Nile cutting through Egypt's eastern edge. But what if everything we think we know about this desert is wrong? What if the Sahara, this symbol of desolation, was once something entirely different? Before we uncover what lies buried beneath all that sand, if you're someone who enjoys discovering that the world isn't quite what it seems, then subscribe and hit that like button. Because tonight's story is going to change how you see not just deserts, but the very ground beneath your feet. Hidden beneath those towering dunes lie the bones of something extraordinary. NASA's Shuttle Radar Topography mission, scanning the desert with technology that sees through sand, has revealed river channels carved deep into the bedrock. Not small streams, but massive waterways, some wider than the Mississippi, others stretching for hundreds of miles through what is now empty wasteland. The European Space Agency's satellites have mapped these buried arteries across the entire desert, creating ghost maps of a landscape that seems impossible. Imagine rivers flowing where now there is only sand. Imagine lakes so vast they dwarf the Great Lakes of North America. The evidence is there, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for the right instruments to reveal it. Ground-penetrating radar shows the unmistakable signatures of ancient shorelines, deltas where rivers once emptied into enormous freshwater seas, channels that carried billions of gallons of water across landscapes that haven't seen a drop of rain in millennia. And it's not just the technology telling this story. Walk through the right museum, and you'll find fossils that make no sense if the Sahara has always been desert. Crocodile bones discovered hundreds of miles from the nearest water. Hippo skulls unearthed where nothing larger than a lizard could survive today. Fish fossils, actual fish, found in places where a swimming pool would evaporate in days. Even more intriguing, archaeologists uncover stone tools littered along places that resemble the outlines of ancient seas, pottery shards in patterns that suggest lakeside settlements, grinding stones that could only have been used to process the kinds of plants that need abundant water to grow. Human artifacts telling the story of communities that lived, worked, and thrived in places where stepping outside without water bottles would kill you in hours. Rock art across the Sahara depicts scenes that seem to come from another world entirely. Giraffes stretching their necks toward acacia trees, elephants gathering at watering holes, cattle herders driving their livestock across grasslands, dancing figures celebrating in landscapes that look nothing like the desert surrounding these ancient galleries today. These aren't fantasies or dreams painted on stone, they're records, documentation of a world that existed in the same place where now only sand remains. French archaeologist Henri Lotte documented thousands of these paintings in Algeria's Tassili Nadja region. Some show boats, actual boats, carved and painted by people who lived in what is now one of the driest places on Earth. Others depict scenes of daily life in green savannas, hunters tracking game through forests, families gathering around lakes that stretched beyond the horizon. The timescales involved make this mystery even more intriguing. Core samples drilled from the floors of ancient lake beds reveal layers of sediment that tell a story spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Alternating bands of organic material and wind-blown sand like pages in a book written by the climate itself. Green periods lasting thousands of years, followed by arid phases that turned rivers into fossil patterns buried beneath dunes. But here's what makes this more than just an interesting geological curiosity: the speed of these transformations. Sediment analysis suggests that some of these changes happened not over millennia, but over centuries, sometimes even faster. Imagine entire civilizations watching their world transform within a human lifetime, lakes shrinking year by year until they became memories, rivers that had flowed for generations simply stopping, grasslands withering into the wasteland we see today. The implications stretch far beyond ancient history. If the Sahara was once green, lush and populated, what does that tell us about the nature of the landscapes we consider permanent? What other deserts might be sleeping forests? What other empty places might once have teemed with life? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if such dramatic changes happened before, what prevents them from happening again? There's something almost overwhelming about trying to grasp the scale of these changes. Lake Megachad, as scientists call it, once covered an area larger than the Caspian Sea. Picture water stretching from horizon to horizon in what is now the heart of the Sahara. Fresh water so abundant that rivers the size of the Nile fed into it from all directions. Shorelines where people built communities, developed cultures, raised families for generation after generation. The technology that revealed these buried landscapes reads like science fiction, but the results are undeniable. Synthetic aperture radar can penetrate up to 10 feet into dry sand, mapping bedrock features that tell the story of water flow. The patterns are unmistakable. Meandering curves that only rivers carve, fan-shaped deltas where waterways once emptied into vast lakes, channel systems that branch and merge exactly as flowing water demands. For decades, French geologist Jean-Charles Fonte traced the details of these formations, measuring them against the living river networks of tropical Africa. The buried channels follow all the same principles, show all the same characteristics. They're not random geological features or wind erosion patterns. They're the fossilized remains of a hydrological system that once rivaled the Amazon basin. Climate cores drilled from the Atlantic Ocean floor tell the same story from a different angle. During what scientists call African humid periods, dust from the Sahara virtually disappears from the sediment record. Instead of the constant stream of sand particles that blows off the desert today, dust that actually fertilizes the Amazon rainforest thousands of miles away, the ocean floors show layers of organic material, pollen, and other debris that only comes from living landscapes. At the University of Bremen, marine biologist Stefan Mulitzer and his team have followed these patterns back more than 400,000 years. The cycle repeats with clockwork regularity, tied to changes in Earth's orbit that shift the monsoon patterns across North Africa. Every 20 to 25,000 years, the rains return. Every time, the desert blooms. Every time, life reclaims landscapes that seemed permanently barren. But the speed of these transitions raises questions that make you pause and think. Sediment analysis from former lake beds suggests some of these changes happened within human timescales. Not geological time, not evolutionary time, time that people could witness, remember, pass down in stories. Imagine being part of a culture that watched their green world slowly brown, then wither, then disappear entirely into sand. The human element makes this mystery personal in ways that pure geology cannot. These weren't empty landscapes transforming in isolation. People lived through these changes. Communities adapted, migrated, sometimes vanished entirely as their world shifted beneath them. The archaeological record shows occupation layers that tell heartbreaking stories of adaptation and abandonment. At sites like Tintorha in Algeria, French archaeologists have found evidence of people returning again and again to the same locations as climate conditions fluctuated. Temporary camps during dry periods, permanent settlements when the rains returned, then abandonment again as the desert reclaimed the land. Layer upon layer of human presence, each generation trying to make sense of a world that seemed determined to change. Etched into the stone, the art preserves scenes of animals and environments that seem almost alien compared to the desert that now surrounds them. But when you study these paintings carefully, patterns emerge that suggest something more complex than simple documentation of daily life. Some images appear to show the transformation itself, green areas giving way to brown, rivers shrinking, animals migrating away from areas that could no longer support them. Henri Lotte's expeditions in the 1950s documented over 8,000 individual rock art sites across the central Sahara. Many show clear sequences, painted over centuries or millennia, that seem to track environmental change. Early images of lush landscapes gradually give way to sparser scenes, finally ending with the kinds of desert animals we associate with the region today. What's particularly striking is how these artistic records match the scientific timeline so precisely. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials found near the paintings aligns almost perfectly with climate data derived from ice cores and ocean sediments. The art isn't just beautiful, it's accurate historical documentation of one of the most dramatic environmental transformations our planet has experienced during human history. Consider what this means for our understanding of civilization itself. The conventional narrative suggests that complex societies developed along major river systems, the Nile, the Euphrates, the Indus. But what if some of the earliest sophisticated cultures actually flourished in places that are now utterly uninhabitable? What if the Sahara, before it became a barrier that divided Africa into northern and sub-Saharan regions, was actually a bridge that connected diverse populations across a green and fertile continent? The implications ripple outward in directions that challenge basic assumptions about human development. If advanced societies existed in what is now the Sahara, and if climate change destroyed them so thoroughly that only fragments remain, what does that suggest about the stability of our own civilizations? How many other green worlds have turned to dust and been forgotten? And then there's the question that hangs over all of this evidence. If these cycles are natural, if they've been happening for hundreds of thousands of years, when will the Sahara turn green again? Climate models suggest the orbital mechanics that drive these changes are still operating. The monsoons that once brought life to the desert will eventually return. The question isn't if, but when. Some scientists believe we might not have to wait another 20,000 years. Changes in ocean circulation, shifts in global weather patterns, could potentially trigger the next green phase much sooner. Imagine the Sahara transforming within our lifetimes, rivers flowing where our grandparents saw only sand, forests growing where our children play in dunes. The Sahara looks eternal, but appearances can be deceiving. Sometimes the most barren places hold the richest secrets, and sometimes the dead heart of the world is just waiting for the right moment to beat again. Tonight we're going to explore what happens when the impossible becomes inevitable, when deserts remember how to dream, and when the past refuses to stay buried beneath the sand. The first hint that something extraordinary lay hidden beneath the Sahara came from an unexpected source: space. In 1981, the Space Shuttle Columbia carried a special radar system designed to map the Earth's surface in ways no previous technology could achieve. The shuttle imaging radar could see through sand, penetrating several meters into the desert floor to reveal the bedrock beneath. What it found changed everything we thought we knew about North Africa. Flowing across the radar images like ghostly rivers were massive channel systems carved deep into the stone foundation of the desert. These weren't small seasonal streams or temporary flood channels. They were enormous waterways that dwarfed most modern rivers, some stretching for over 1,000 miles through landscapes where a cup of water is now worth more than gold. The patterns were unmistakable. The meandering curves that only flowing water can carve, the branching networks that develop over millions of years of erosion, the wide valleys that speak of rivers carrying tremendous volumes of water year after year, century after century. Dr. Farouk El-Baz, who worked with NASA on lunar mapping before turning his attention to Earth's deserts, spent years analysing these buried waterways. The largest of them, running roughly north to south through what is now Libya and Chad, was comparable in size to the modern Nile. But unlike the Nile, which flows through a relatively narrow valley, this ancient river system spread across a network of channels and tributaries that covered an area larger than France. The implications were staggering. Rivers require consistent rainfall, stable climate patterns, entire ecosystems of vegetation to prevent erosion and maintain flow. You don't get waterways of this magnitude from occasional flash floods or temporary climate fluctuations. These channels spoke of a fundamentally different world, a Sahara where water was abundant enough to carve permanent features into the landscape. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted throughout the 1990s and 2000s revealed even more detail. French research teams working with the Institut de Recherche pour le Développement mapped subsurface features across Algeria, Niger and Chad, building a picture of hydrological complexity that rivaled the Amazon basin. Buried deltas where ancient rivers emptied into vast lakes, oxbow formations where waterways had changed course over time, alluvial deposits that could only have formed from centuries of flowing water carrying sediment across the continent. But the most extraordinary discovery was still to come. Lake Megachad, as paleoclimatologists named it, represented something almost beyond comprehension. During the last major humid period, roughly 8 to 10,000 years ago, this single body of water covered over 140,000 square miles. To put that in perspective, it was larger than Germany, deeper than Lake Superior, holding more fresh water than all of North America's Great Lakes combined. The evidence for this massive lake comes from multiple sources, each confirming what the others suggest. Diatomaceous earth, microscopic algae that only grow in fresh water, found in sediment cores across the Chad Basin. Beach ridges and wave-cut terraces carved into bedrock hundreds of miles from any current water source. Limestone formations that develop only in the presence of abundant fresh water over thousands of years. Dr. Stefan Kropelin from the University of Cologne has spent his career studying these paleolake systems, drilling core samples from what were once lake floors deep in the Sahara. The sediment layers tell detailed stories of aquatic ecosystems that flourished, where now even the hardiest desert plants struggle to survive. Pollen grains from water lilies, cattails, and dozens of other freshwater plants. Fish scales and mollusk shells from species that require permanent, stable water bodies to reproduce and thrive. Even more intriguing are the human artifacts found along these ancient shorelines. Stone tools crafted from materials that had to be transported from distant sources, suggesting trade networks that connected communities across the Green Sahara. Pottery fragments decorated with wave patterns and aquatic motifs. Grinding stones sized for processing the seeds of marsh plants and water chestnuts. Fishing weights and harpoon points designed for catching the kinds of large freshwater fish that need deep, stable lakes to survive. The Sahara wasn't just green during these humid periods, it was an aquatic paradise. Crocodile fossils found near Bilma, in what is now Niger's Sahara Desert, belong to species that grew over 20 feet long. These weren't occasional visitors or evolutionary oddities. They were apex predators that required abundant prey fish, suitable nesting sites, and year-round water to maintain breeding populations. The same deposits yield hippo bones, turtle shells, and the remains of freshwater rays. Entire aquatic ecosystems flourishing in places where a swimming pool would evaporate in days under the current climate. Far from just adapting, humans found ways to thrive in this aquatic landscape, as the archaeology reveals. The Gobero site in Niger, excavated by Paul Sereno's team from the University of Chicago, revealed evidence of complex societies that lived along these ancient lake shores for thousands of years. Elaborate burials with jewellery crafted from materials that could only be obtained through long-distance trade. Settlements that show continuous occupation through multiple generations. Cultural artifacts that speak of people who saw themselves as permanent residents of a landscape they expected would always provide. What makes these discoveries particularly striking is how they challenge our assumptions about the relationship between environment and civilization. We tend to think of advanced societies as developing despite environmental challenges, overcoming obstacles through technology and organization. But the Green Sahara suggests something different. Civilizations that developed because their environment was so rich, so stable, so abundantly provided for that complex cultures could flourish without the constant struggle for basic resources that characterizes desert life. The rock art scattered across these former lake regions provides a visual record of this abundance. Images of boats navigating waters that stretched beyond the horizon. Fishing scenes with nets full of species that vanished when the lakes dried. Hunting expeditions pursuing game across savannas where acacia trees provided shade and streams provided water for both predator and prey. At Jabaran, in Algeria's Tassili Naja, paintings show scenes of pastoral life that seem lifted from modern East Africa. Cattle herders driving their livestock to watering places, women gathering plants along riverbanks, children playing in landscapes green with vegetation and alive with animals. These aren't idealized visions or mythological scenes. They're documentation, created by people who lived in a world we can barely imagine. Plant records back up the images carved in stone. During humid phases, pollen evidence reveals the Sahara-supported northern Mediterranean flora, southern tropical savanna, and wide bands of temperate grassland in between. Oak and cedar forests grew where now only the most drought-resistant shrubs can survive. Rivers lined with gallery forests wound through landscapes that supported everything from elephants to antelopes to the wild ancestors of modern cattle. At Colombia's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, Dr. Peter Domenical has shown that these shifts unfolded in patterns we can now trace with remarkable precision. Deep-sea sediment cores from off the West African coast show abrupt changes in the types of dust and organic material blown off the continent. During green periods, virtually no Saharan sand reaches the ocean. Instead, the cores contain pollen, leaf fragments, and other debris from living ecosystems. The speed of these transitions, when they occurred, seems almost impossible to believe. Some sediment sequences suggest that major environmental shifts happened over periods as short as a few centuries. For people living through such changes, it would mean watching their world transform within a single lifetime. Rivers that had flowed for generations simply stopping. Lakes that had supported fishing communities for millennia gradually shrinking until they became seasonal pools, then mudflats, then nothing but cracked earth under endless blue sky. Tuareg storytellers speak of a forgotten time when their people thrived along great rivers, in channels that today survive only as barren wadis. These stories describe landscapes of abundance, places where hunting was easy and water never scarce. They remember the names of the lakes and rivers that exist now only in memory, passed down through generations who have known nothing but sand and stone. No slow transition appears in the record, only abrupt changes that left little room for adjustment. Isotope analysis from mollusk shells found in former lake beds shows that some water bodies experience dramatic drops in level over periods measured in decades rather than millennia. Imagine communities that had lived for centuries along stable shorelines suddenly finding themselves miles from the nearest water. Imagine the social upheaval, the forced migrations, the collapse of ways of life that had seemed as permanent as the landscape itself. Even so, perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this buried history is what it suggests about the nature of change itself. The Sahara wasn't transformed once and then left barren forever. The cycle repeated again and again across hundreds of thousands of years. Each time the rains returned, life reclaimed the desert with astonishing speed. Seeds that had waited decades in dormancy sprouted within seasons of adequate rainfall. Rivers carved new channels or reclaimed their ancient courses. Animals migrated back from refugia where their populations had survived the dry periods. This cyclical nature raises profound questions about our understanding of permanence and change. We see the Sahara as it is today and assume it has always been this way, that its current state represents some kind of natural equilibrium, but the evidence suggests something far more dynamic, a landscape in constant flux, alternating between abundance and scarcity, according to rhythms that operate on scales too vast for individual human lives to comprehend. The next time you see an image of the Sahara, those endless dunes rolling toward the horizon, remember what lies beneath. Remember the rivers that once flowed there, the lakes that once reflected stars in water deeper than anything we see today. Remember the forests and grasslands, the animals and people who made their lives in a world so different from what we see now that it seems like another planet entirely. Beneath every grain of sand lies a story of transformation, and beneath every story of transformation lies a question. What else have we forgotten about the world we think we know? There's something deeply unsettling about discovering that what you thought was permanent has actually been cycling between extremes for longer than our species has existed. The Sahara's transformation from green paradise to barren wasteland isn't a one-time catastrophe frozen in geological time. It's a rhythm, a planetary heartbeat that has pulsed across hundreds of thousands of years with the regularity of clockwork. The trigger for these massive changes lies 23,000 miles above our heads, written in the orbital mechanics that govern our planet's relationship with the Sun. Earth's axis wobbles like a spinning top slowing down, completing a full cycle roughly every 23,000 years. This wobble, called precession, determines which hemisphere receives more intense summer radiation and when. It's a subtle shift in cosmic terms, but on Earth, subtle changes in solar heating can redirect entire weather systems across continents. During certain phases of this cycle, North African summers become significantly more intense. The enhanced heating draws moisture-laden winds deeper into the continent, pulling monsoon rains far north of their current limits. What we know today as the seasonal rains that water the Sahel, that narrow band of semi-arid land south of the Sahara, expand northward, sometimes reaching as far as the Mediterranean coast. Imagine the first rains arriving after millennia of drought, seeds that have waited in the sand for generations suddenly sprouting as dormant desert soil drinks water it hasn't tasted in 20,000 years, temporary pools forming in depressions that become permanent lakes as the rains continue season after season, vegetation taking hold, creating soil, retaining moisture, establishing the positive feedback loops that can transform entire ecosystems within centuries. Unlikely archives reveal the pattern. Sediment beds beneath the Atlantic just off West Africa record each chapter in astonishing detail. During green periods, the wind carries pollen, organic matter, and fine particles from living ecosystems out to sea. During dry periods, coarse sand and dust from exposed desert surfaces dominate the marine sediments. The alternation between these layers creates a geological barcode that scientists can read back through time. What emerges from this record is both beautiful and terrifying in its regularity. The pattern repeats with such consistency that you can predict when past green periods occurred simply by calculating orbital cycles. 23,000 years ago, green Sahara. 46,000 years ago, green Sahara. 69,000 years ago, green Sahara. Like a metronome keeping time on scales that dwarf human history. But the transitions themselves reveal something that challenges everything we think we know about gradual climate change. Marine sediment cores show that some of these shifts from green to desert occurred over periods as short as 300 years. In human terms, that means great-grandparents who fished in permanent lakes could have great-grandchildren who never saw standing water except during the brief, seasonal rains that mark the desert's dry phase. The speed of these transitions becomes even more remarkable when you consider the sheer scale of what was changing. We're not talking about local weather variations or regional droughts. The Green Sahara covered an area larger than the continental United States. Rivers flowed where now there is only sand. Lakes held more water than all of North America's Great Lakes combined. Forests stretched across landscapes that today receive less rainfall than Death Valley. Evidence from archaeology shows humans didn't watch these shifts from afar. They endured them, adapting their ways of life as landscapes changed across continents in the span of remembered lifetimes. Sites across the Sahara show occupation layers that follow the climate cycles, permanent settlements during green periods, temporary camps during intermediate phases, complete abandonment during the driest centuries. The rock art scattered across the desert provides a visual timeline of these transformations. Early paintings show lush landscapes teeming with water-dependent animals, hippos, crocodiles, elephants, giraffes. Later images depict more arid environments with different species, gazelles, ostriches, eventually the camels and desert-adapted animals we associate with the region today. It's like watching time-lapse photography of an entire continent's ecological transformation painted by people who lived through different phases of the cycle. Some of the most poignant images seem to document the transition itself. Paintings that show rivers running low, animals gathering around shrinking water sources, people driving their cattle toward distant lakes. There's an artistic sequence at Tin Tazarif that appears to show the same landscape over several generations. First green and abundant, then increasingly sparse, finally showing only the rocky outcrops and sand dunes that exist there today. These cycles don't just belong to the past. If orbital mechanics really set the rhythm, then it's possible to predict when the Sahara will once again burst into green. The mathematics suggest that the next major humid period should begin in roughly 15,000 years, when precession once again aligns to pull monsoon rains deep into North Africa. But recent climate research suggests the timeline might be more complicated. Current global warming appears to be altering the atmospheric circulation patterns that drive these regional changes. Some models suggest that rising temperatures could actually accelerate the return of green conditions by intensifying the thermal contrasts that draw moisture into continental interiors. Others indicate that changing ocean temperatures might disrupt the monsoon systems entirely, breaking cycles that have operated for millions of years. There are already hints that something is shifting. Satellite data shows increasing vegetation in parts of the southern Sahara over the past several decades. Rainfall patterns across the Sahel have become more variable and intense. Desert communities report changes in the seasonal timing of what little precipitation they receive. Whether these represent the early stages of cyclical change or completely new climate dynamics remains an open question. Human experience within these cycles sparks deep questions about how civilizations and environments shape one another. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of the most sophisticated early cultures developed during Green Sahara periods, taking advantage of abundant resources and stable conditions to build complex societies. When the climate shifted, these civilizations either adapted by migrating to more favourable areas or simply vanished, leaving behind only archaeological traces and rock art to document their existence. Consider what this means for our understanding of cultural development. The rise of ancient Egypt, with its dependence on Nile agriculture and its connections to sub-Saharan Africa, coincided with the end of the last Green Sahara period. As the desert expanded and lakes dried, populations concentrated along the remaining rivers, possibly accelerating the social organisation and technological innovation that characterised early dynastic periods. The same pattern appears to have played out across North Africa. As conditions became increasingly arid, scattered communities were forced to aggregate around diminishing water sources. This concentration of population created both opportunities for cultural exchange and pressures for social organisation that may have accelerated the development of more complex societies. But there's something deeply humbling about recognising that even our most impressive civilizations developed partly as responses to environmental changes beyond human control. The monuments we build, the cities we establish, the cultures we create, all exist within cycles of change that operate on scales we're only beginning to understand. Today's satellite images expose the Sahara as a canvas still marked by those ancient transformations. Buried river channels that show up as lines of slightly different colour in the sand, circular depressions that mark the locations of former lakes, ridge patterns that indicate ancient shorelines now hundreds of miles from the nearest water. The entire desert is a palimpsest, a manuscript where new text has been written over old, but careful examination can still reveal what came before. Scattered ruins and artefacts across the Sahara trace lives of adaptation and migration, alongside moments where whole settlements were left behind in the face of overwhelming change. Some communities successfully transitioned from lake-based fishing cultures to desert-adapted pastoral societies. Others simply vanished from the archaeological record, their fates lost to time and shifting sand. The cyclical nature of these changes adds another layer of complexity to our understanding of environmental transformation. This isn't a simple story of paradise lost, of a one-time catastrophe that turned a garden into a wasteland. It's something more nuanced and perhaps more hopeful, a reminder that even the most dramatic environmental changes are part of larger patterns that include both destruction and renewal. One day the desert will bloom. The orbital mechanics that drive these cycles continue to operate with the same precision they have maintained for millions of years. 15,000 years from now, or perhaps sooner, if current climate trends accelerate the timeline, monsoon rains will once again penetrate deep into North Africa. Rivers will flow where now there is only sand. Lakes will fill depressions that have been dry for millennia. Life will reclaim landscapes that seem permanently barren. But what will happen to the civilizations that exist when these changes occur? How will human societies adapt to transformations that occur over time scales that challenge our ability to plan and prepare? Will future archaeologists find traces of our cities buried beneath the sediments of Saharan lakes that don't yet exist? The cycles that transform the Sahara remind us that permanence is largely an illusion, that the landscapes we consider eternal are actually temporary configurations in an ongoing dance between orbital mechanics, atmospheric circulation, and the patient persistence of life waiting for its moment to return. When you walk across certain parts of the Chad Basin today, your feet are treading on what was once the bottom of one of the largest freshwater lakes in Earth's history. The ground beneath you holds secrets, pottery shards that once held water drawn from vast shorelines, fish bones from species that required deep, permanent lakes to survive, human remains from communities that flourished for millennia along waters that stretched beyond the horizon. Lake Megachad wasn't just big, it was a world unto itself. During its maximum extent around 8,000 years ago, This single body of water covered nearly 150,000 square miles, holding roughly 8,000 cubic miles of fresh water. To put that in perspective, it contained more water than all of North America's Great Lakes combined. If you stood on its southern shore in what is now Nigeria, the northern banks in Libya would have been completely beyond sight, hidden by the curvature of the Earth itself. But the numbers, impressive as they are, can't really convey what this meant for the people who lived along its shores. Archaeological evidence suggests that Lake Megachad wasn't just a geographical feature, it was the centre of a world, the foundation upon which entire cultures built their understanding of life and landscape. Along the ancient shorelines, now marked only by subtle changes in soil composition and the occasional fragment of pottery, archaeologists have found evidence of settlements that persisted for millennia. These weren't temporary camps or seasonal fishing stations. They were permanent communities with elaborate burial grounds, sophisticated pottery traditions, and tool technologies that required long-term cultural transmission to maintain. The Gobera site in Niger provides our most detailed window into life during the age of the Great Lakes. Here, along what was once the western shore of a substantial lake connected to the Megachad system, French and American archaeologists uncovered a cemetery that spans nearly 5,000 years of continuous use. The earliest burials date to around 8,000 years ago, when the lake was at its fullest extent and the surrounding landscape supported abundant game and diverse plant communities. What emerges from these graves is a picture of societies that were both sophisticated and stable. The oldest burials show evidence of elaborate mortuary practices, bodies arranged in specific positions, accompanied by personal ornaments crafted from materials that had to be traded across considerable distances. Polished stone axes, delicate bone harpoons designed for fishing in deep water, ceramic vessels decorated with intricate geometric patterns that suggest shared artistic traditions across wide areas. Bones left behind reveal people who thrived in a land far kinder than the desert we know today. Analysis of bone chemistry reveals diets rich in fish protein, supplemented by a variety of wild plants and game animals. Dental patterns show less wear than is typical for societies dependent on coarse grains, suggesting access to varied and relatively soft foods. Growth patterns indicate that children generally received adequate nutrition during crucial developmental periods. But perhaps most intriguingly, the Gobera burials show evidence of cultural continuity that spans the gradual transformation of the environment. Later graves, dating to periods when the lakes were shrinking and the climate becoming more arid, show adaptations in both burial practices and the types of artifacts included with the dead. Fishing gear gives way to hunting equipment designed for pursuing increasingly desert-adapted game. Pottery styles evolve to reflect changing needs and perhaps changing aesthetic preferences. The rock art scattered across these former lake regions provides another window into the lives of people who witnessed one of the most dramatic environmental transformations in human history. At sites like Tassili Niger and the Tibesti Mountains, paintings and engravings document not just daily life during the green periods, but what appears to be the gradual recognition that their world was changing in fundamental ways. Early rock art from these regions shows scenes of abundance that seem almost fantastical to anyone familiar with the modern Sahara. Boats navigating waters that stretch to the horizon, fishing parties returning with nets full of large freshwater fish, hunting scenes that include elephants, hippos, rhinoceros, and dozens of other species that require permanent water and abundant vegetation to survive. But the artistic record also captures something more subtle, and perhaps more poignant: the gradual awareness that abundance wasn't permanent. Later paintings show scenes that seem to document environmental stress, animals gathering around shrinking water sources, hunting parties having to travel farther from their settlements to find game, pastoral scenes that show cattle being driven toward distant lakes, suggesting that local water sources were becoming unreliable. Some of the most striking images appear to show the lakes themselves in various stages of retreat. Paintings that depict shorelines with distinct high water marks, as if the artists were documenting the maximum extent of waters that were already beginning to recede. Boat scenes that show vessels stranded on what appear to be mudflats or newly exposed lake bottoms. The cultural implications of living through such changes are difficult for us to fully grasp. Imagine being part of a society whose entire worldview, whose religious beliefs, whose economic systems, whose social organization had developed around the assumption that water would always be abundant. Then imagine watching that abundance slowly disappear over the course of several generations. Findings suggest human responses to these transformations varied widely from place to place. Some appear to have gradually shifted from fishing-based economies to pastoralism, following their herds as they moved toward increasingly distant water sources. Others seem to have intensified their fishing efforts in shrinking lakes, developing more sophisticated techniques for exploiting diminishing resources. The pottery record from lakeside sites shows interesting patterns that might reflect these adaptations. Early ceramics from the humid periods tend to be large, elaborate vessels clearly designed for storing and processing abundant resources. As conditions became more arid, pottery styles shift towards smaller, more portable forms, suggesting societies that were becoming increasingly mobile as they followed retreating water sources. Shifts in toolmaking reveal how people adjusted to new conditions. Early assemblages from lakeside sites are dominated by fishing equipment, sophisticated harpoons, weighted nets, fishhooks crafted from bone and metal. Later assemblages show increasing emphasis on hunting gear and pastoral tools, reflecting economies that were shifting away from aquatic resources toward terrestrial alternatives. However, the most fascinating aspect of the archaeological record is what it suggests about cultural memory and the transmission of knowledge across periods of environmental change. Some sites show evidence of reoccupation during brief periods when local conditions improved, suggesting that communities maintained knowledge of productive locations across generations and returned to them when circumstances permitted. Tales passed down among Saharan communities suggest deep cultural recollections of the old lake periods. Tuareg stories speak of ancestors who lived by great waters, who knew the secrets of fishing in lakes that stretched beyond sight, who travelled by boat across waters that connected distant lands. These traditions describe landscapes of abundance, places where hunting was easy and water never scarce, where communities could remain in one place for many generations without exhausting local resources. Some of these oral histories include specific details that align remarkably well with archaeological and geological evidence. Stories of great droughts that lasted for many years, of lakes that shrank until they became only seasonal pools, of communities forced to abandon ancestral territories and seek new homes in distant lands. Whether these represent actual cultural memories transmitted across millennia or simply universal human responses to environmental stress remains an open question. Open question, but the parallels are striking. The genetic evidence adds another layer to this story of adaptation and migration. DNA analysis of modern North African populations suggests significant population movements that correlate with the timing of major climate transitions. Some lineages appear to have origins in regions that are now deep desert, but were once well-watered lakeland. Others show connections to populations in the Nile Valley and East Africa, suggesting migration routes that followed the retreat of habitable conditions. What emerges from all this evidence is a picture of the late Green Sahara as a cultural laboratory where human societies experimented with different strategies for dealing with environmental change on unprecedented scales. Some communities successfully adapted to increasingly arid conditions and became the ancestors of modern desert peoples. Others migrated to more stable regions and contributed to the cultural development of civilizations along permanent rivers like the Nile, but many simply vanished from the archaeological record, their fates unknown. Settlements that show evidence of elaborate social organization and sophisticated technologies simply end, with no clear indication of what happened to their inhabitants. Did they migrate and integrate with other communities? Did they struggle unsuccessfully to adapt to changing conditions? Did they face conflicts with other groups as resources became increasingly scarce? The mystery of these lost lake peoples raises profound questions about human resilience and the limits of cultural adaptation. How many sophisticated societies developed around Lake Megachad and the other great water bodies of the Green Sahara? What knowledge, what achievements, what innovations disappeared when the lakes dried and their communities scattered or vanished? There's something deeply moving about standing in what is now empty desert and knowing that thousands of years ago, this same spot might have been a bustling lakeside community. Fishermen setting out in the early morning light, children playing along sandy beaches, families gathering to process the day's catch, while elders shared stories of distant places connected by waterways that stretched across continents. The silence of the modern desert seems even more profound when you consider the voices that once filled these landscapes. The calls of fishermen coordinating their efforts on vast lakes, the sounds of communities celebrating successful hunts or abundant harvests, the everyday conversations of people living in landscapes so rich that scarcity was barely imaginable. All of that is gone now, buried beneath sand or preserved only in fragments of pottery and scattered stone tools. But the evidence is there, waiting to be discovered, waiting to tell us more about what it means for entire worlds to rise and fall with the changing of the climate. The lost lakes of the Sahara remind us that even the most abundant environments are temporary, that the landscapes we build our lives around are subject to forces beyond human control. But they also demonstrate the remarkable adaptability of human cultures, the creativity with which our species responds to challenges that would seem insurmountable. Somewhere beneath the sand, the shores of Lake Megachad still exist, waiting for the day when the rains return, and life once again claims the landscapes that seem permanently barren. When that time comes, and orbital mechanics suggest it will, what new stories will begin along those ancient shorelines, hidden in the rocky highlands of Algeria? Thousands of feet above the sand seas that now dominate the Sahara lies one of humanity's most extraordinary art galleries. The Tassili Naja Plateau stretches across nearly 30,000 square miles of weathered sandstone, its walls and overhangs covered with paintings and engravings that span roughly 12,000 years of continuous artistic expression. What makes this ancient museum particularly remarkable isn't just its size or age. It's what the images reveal about a world that existed in the same place where today even the hardiest desert plants struggle to survive. The paintings here don't just document daily life, they chronicle the transformation of an entire continent. Layer upon layer of artistic expression, created by different cultures across millennia, building a visual timeline that shows the Sahara's gradual change from green paradise to barren wasteland. It's like watching a slow-motion movie of environmental catastrophe, painted by the people who lived through it. When the desert was lush and full of water, early artists carved visions that seem alien today. Elephants pacing single file through grassland shaded by acacia trees, giraffes browsing on vegetation that grew tall enough to require their extraordinary height, rhinoceros wallowing in muddy watering holes surrounded by diverse wildlife. These aren't mythological creatures or symbolic representations, they're careful observations of animals that actually lived in landscapes now buried beneath sand dunes. But it's the human figures in these early paintings that really capture your imagination. Hunters with elaborate headdresses pursuing game through forests that stretched across regions now completely barren. Dancers celebrating in clearings surrounded by trees that required abundant rainfall to survive. Families gathering around campfires in landscapes green with vegetation, their faces turned upward towards skies that delivered life-giving rain on predictable schedules. Some of the most striking images show boats, actual sailing vessels navigating waters that stretch to the horizon. The detail in these maritime scenes is extraordinary. Artists carefully rendered the construction of hulls designed for deep water navigation, the rigging of sails meant to catch winds that blew across vast lake surfaces, the posture of crews managing vessels on waters that required real seamanship to traverse safely. At Barren, one of the most spectacular rock art sites in the region, a painting shows what appears to be a fleet of boats engaged in some kind of organised activity. Perhaps fishing, perhaps transportation, perhaps even warfare. The vessels are large enough to carry multiple passengers, sophisticated enough to suggest shipbuilding traditions that required generations to develop and perfect. These weren't simple rafts or canoes. They were seaworthy craft designed by people who understood the demands of navigating substantial bodies of water. The pastoral period paintings, created as the climate began to shift toward more arid conditions, show the adaptation strategies that human communities developed as their world changed around them. Cattle herders driving their livestock across landscapes that were becoming increasingly dry. Scenes of people tending goats and sheep, animals better adapted to scarce vegetation and limited water than the wild game that dominated earlier artistic periods. But even these pastoral images retain elements that seem impossible given the current environment. Cattle depicted as healthy and well-fed, suggesting pastures that could support large herds, Scenes of people milking cows beside streams that flowed year-round. Images of seasonal migrations that followed patterns of rainfall and vegetation. Growth across regions where now a single blade of grass would be a remarkable discovery. Changing conditions left their imprint not only on life but on expression. From the wetter epochs survive great murals stretching across rock expanses, filled with elaborate groupings of men, women and animals in motion. The artist had time to invest in ambitious projects, resources to obtain pigments from distant sources, stable communities that could support specialized artistic traditions. Later works, created as conditions became increasingly harsh, show different characteristics: smaller, more focused compositions, simplified artistic styles that could be executed more quickly with locally available materials, subjects that reflect the changing reality of life in an increasingly arid environment, desert animals, scenes of scarcity, images that seem to document struggle rather than abundance. The Tintazarif site contains what might be the most poignant artistic sequence in the entire Sahara, a series of paintings that seem to document the same landscape across several centuries of environmental change. The earliest layer shows a riverine scene with boats, fishing activities and abundant wildlife. Subsequent paintings, created over the same earlier images, show the river shrinking, the vegetation becoming sparser, the wildlife changing from water-dependent species to more desert-adapted animals. In its final stage, the artwork records only the stark landscape, bare stone and the scattered traces of desert vegetation we see now. It's as if the artist were deliberately documenting the death of their world, creating a visual record of transformation that they somehow knew future generations would need to understand what had been lost. Some of the most mysterious images in the Tassili galleries have sparked intense speculation about what they might represent. Figures with elaborate headdresses that some interpret as helmets or protective gear, beings with elongated limbs and unusual proportions that don't quite match normal human anatomy, scenes that show apparent interactions between these unusual figures and more conventionally depicted humans. The so-called round-head period paintings, among the oldest in the region, include images that are genuinely difficult to interpret. Large figures with circular heads and bodies that seem to float rather than walk across the landscape. Scenes of apparent ceremonies or rituals involving these mysterious beings and groups of more recognizable human participants. Whether these represent shamanic visions, mythological beings, memories of encounters with peoples from distant regions, or something else entirely remains an open question. What's clear is that the artists who created these images were documenting experiences or beliefs that were significant enough to merit permanent recording on stone walls that required considerable effort to access and decorate. Sophistication in Tassili's artwork hints at communities secure enough to afford leisure, cultivate expertise, and sustain culture across generations. Creating paintings on the scale found in these galleries required planning, cooperation, and access to resources that went far beyond basic survival needs. Artists needed time to develop their skills, materials to create lasting pigments, social support that freed them from constant food acquisition to focus on cultural expression. The pigments themselves tell stories about the world these artists inhabited. Chemical analysis reveals colours derived from minerals that had to be obtained from sources hundreds of miles away, suggesting trade networks that connected communities across vast distances. Some pigments required complex processing techniques that indicate specialised knowledge passed down through generations of artistic tradition. What is most striking is how the images themselves have lasted through ages of shifting climates and time. The dry climate that eventually claimed the Green Sahara has protected the paintings from the humidity and organic decay that destroy rock art in more temperate regions. The remote locations of many sites have protected them from human interference. The hard sandstone surfaces have proven resistant to erosion and weathering. Most striking of all, the way these sites are scattered across the Sahara shows that art was a shared cultural practice during the green periods, not confined to select places or privileged groups. Thousands of decorated sites have been documented across the region, from Morocco to Sudan, from Libya to Niger. This wasn't the work of a single culture or time period. It was a tradition that spanned millennia and involved communities across an entire continent. The themes that appear repeatedly across these diverse sites suggest shared cultural values and perhaps common responses to environmental change. images of abundance giving way to scenes of scarcity, celebrations of human community and cooperation, documentation of the animals, plants and landscapes that sustained life during different periods, apparent rituals or ceremonies that might have been attempts to understand or influence the forces that were transforming their world. Satellite views show that many rock art sites sit along the ghost paths of ancient travel routes that once tied together the Green Sahara. Mountain passes that provided access between lake basins, highland areas that remained habitable even as lowland regions became increasingly arid, strategic locations that controlled access to water sources or mineral deposits. This suggests that the art sites served functions beyond simple artistic expression. They might have been territorial markers, places where different communities came together for trade or cultural exchange, locations where important knowledge was preserved for future generations. The consistent themes and artistic techniques found across widely separated sites suggest communication and cultural exchange on scales that rival modern continental networks. The rock art of the Sahara represents humanity's longest-running documentary project, a visual record of environmental change spanning thousands of years, created by the people who witnessed one of the most dramatic transformations in our planet's recent history. These images preserve not just what the Green Sahara looked like, but how it felt to live in a world that was gradually dying, how human communities adapted to changes beyond their control, how artists struggled to capture and preserve memories of abundance for generations who would know only scarcity. Standing before these ancient galleries today, surrounded by the silence and emptiness of the modern desert, the painted figures seem to watch from the walls with expressions that are both timeless and achingly specific to their vanished world. They remind us that behind every environmental statistic, every climate graph, every archaeological data point, are real people who lived through changes that redefine not just landscapes, but the fundamental conditions of human existence. From the Green Sahara comes an inheritance etched in stone, a gift greater than treasure, the vision of worlds dissolving, of transformations that overwhelm single lives yet still compel remembrance, carrying forward truths about the intimate bond between human communities and their sustaining environments. Around 5,000 years ago, something changed in the skies above North Africa. The monsoon rains that had watered the Sahara for millennia began to weaken, arriving later each season, delivering less moisture, sometimes failing entirely for years at a time. What followed was one of the most dramatic environmental collapses in human history, the death of a green world and the birth of the desert we know today. The transformation wasn't gradual in the way we usually think about climate change. Sediment cores from former lake beds reveal that some water bodies dropped dozens of feet within decades. Pollen records show that entire forest ecosystems vanished within centuries. Archaeological sites that had been occupied continuously for thousands of years were suddenly abandoned, their inhabitants scattering to destinations we can only guess at from the few traces they left behind. Imagine watching your world die in real time. Springs that had flowed for generations suddenly running dry. Lakes that had sustained fishing communities for millennia shrinking year by year until they became seasonal pools, then mudflats, then nothing but cracked earth baking under relentless sun. Rivers that had carved channels deep into bedrock simply stopping, their former courses marked only by lines of slightly different vegetation clinging to underground moisture. The speed of this collapse challenges everything we think we know about environmental resilience. Modern ecological theory suggests that established ecosystems have momentum, that they resist change and persist even when conditions shift. But the end of the Green Sahara demonstrates that even the most abundant landscapes can reach tipping points, where feedback systems that maintain stability suddenly reverse and accelerate destruction. As water sources failed, vegetation died. As vegetation died, soil that had been held in place by root systems began to blow away in massive dust storms. As soil disappeared, the land's ability to retain what little moisture remained from occasional rains diminished further. The very landscape that had once trapped and held water became a mechanism for dispersing it, turning brief downpours into flash floods that carved gullies and carried away what remained of the organic matter that had supported life. Findings indicate that societies tried diverse methods to adapt as conditions altered. Some sites show evidence of people digging deeper and deeper wells as water tables dropped. Others reveal attempts to construct reservoirs and channels to capture and conserve the diminishing rainfall. Settlement patterns show communities gradually concentrating around the most reliable water sources, abandoning marginal areas as they became too risky to inhabit. The pottery record from this transitional period tells particularly poignant stories of adaptation and abandonment. Early vessels from these sites tend to be large storage jars designed for communities that could afford to stay in one place and accumulate resources over time. As conditions deteriorated, ceramic styles shift towards smaller, more portable forms, suggesting societies that were becoming increasingly mobile, following retreating water sources and abandoning the settled lifestyle that had characterized the humid periods. Even the tools bear witness. Once geared toward abundant fish, they evolve into instruments of the hunt, suited for scarce creatures wary of human pursuit. Agricultural implements designed for working rich, moist soils are replaced by tools suited to more marginal environments. The sophistication of crafted goods decreases, suggesting that communities had less time and energy to invest in activities beyond basic survival. But where did all these people go? The Green Sahara had supported populations that numbered in the millions, living in communities scattered across an area larger than the continental United States. When their world collapsed, these weren't just individual families seeking new homes. These were entire cultures, languages, traditions, and knowledge systems that had to find new places in a rapidly changing world. Genetic evidence suggests that many Saharan populations migrated toward the Nile Valley, contributing to the cultural and demographic foundations that would eventually give rise to ancient Egyptian civilization. The timing is remarkable. The end of the Green Sahara corresponds almost exactly with the emergence of complex societies along the Nile. It's tempting to see these as connected events, to wonder whether the concentration of Saharan refugees along one of the few remaining reliable water sources helped catalyze the social organization and cultural innovation that characterized early dynastic Egypt. Other populations appear to have moved south, carrying cultural traditions and technological knowledge into sub-Saharan Africa. Linguistic analysis suggests that several major African language families may have their origins in populations that dispersed from the drying Sahara. The spread of certain agricultural techniques, pottery styles, and ironworking technologies across West Africa follows patterns that could represent the movement of people and ideas from communities fleeing environmental collapse. Some groups migrated west toward the Atlantic coast, where archaeological sites show the sudden appearance of new cultural traditions that combine Saharan elements with local coastal adaptations. Others moved east toward the Red Sea Hills and the highlands of Ethiopia, regions that remained relatively well watered even as the Sahara dried. Stories passed down among modern African peoples seem to echo the memory of this great migration. Stories of ancestors who lived by vast waters, who knew the secrets of fishing in lakes that stretched beyond sight, who were forced to abandon ancestral lands when the rains failed and the waters disappeared. These traditions speak of great migrations, of communities splitting apart as different groups sought different strategies for survival in a world that was no longer able to support the population it had sustained for millennia. Tuareg legends describe a time when their ancestors lived in green lands with abundant water, when travel between distant communities was easy, because rivers connected different regions. These stories often include details about the gradual drying, the increasing distances between reliable water sources, the difficult decisions about when to abandon traditional territories and seek new homes in unfamiliar lands. Some of the most intriguing archaeological evidence comes from sites that show repeated occupation and abandonment during this transitional period. Communities would settle around a water source for several generations, then suddenly leave when conditions became untenable. Decades or centuries later, different groups would reoccupy the same locations during brief periods when local conditions improved, only to abandon them again as aridity intensified. These patterns suggest that the collapse of the Green Sahara wasn't a single catastrophic event, but a series of crises separated by brief recoveries that gave communities hope that conditions might stabilize. Archaeological layers from these repeatedly occupied sites often show evidence of people returning to collect items they had been forced to leave behind, or attempting to restart agricultural activities in areas that had supported farming during earlier periods. The psychological impact of living through such changes is difficult for us to fully comprehend. These weren't communities that could simply relocate to similar environments elsewhere. The Green Sahara had been unique, a vast oasis surrounded by arid regions that couldn't support similar population densities or ways of life. When it collapsed, entire worldviews, belief systems, and cultural practices became obsolete almost overnight. The psychological impact of living through such changes is difficult for us to fully comprehend. Images of conflict between human groups, possibly representing competition for increasingly scarce resources. Scenes that appear to show supernatural beings or forces, perhaps reflecting attempts to understand or propitiate whatever powers were responsible for the environmental changes. Repeated motifs involving death, transformation, and journey themes that might represent both literal and metaphorical responses to the collapse of familiar worlds. Climate records from other parts of the world show that the end of the Green Sahara was part of a broader pattern of environmental change that affected many regions around the same time. The same orbital cycles that had brought abundant rainfall to North Africa were shifting to favour different patterns of atmospheric circulation. Monsoon systems that had operated reliably for millennia began to weaken or change their seasonal timing. But the Sahara's transformation was particularly dramatic because of its size and the extent to which human populations had come to depend on its abundance. Other regions experienced drought or climate shifts, but few hosted populations of comparable size or cultural complexity. The collapse of the Green Sahara represents one of the largest forced migrations in human history, a dispersal that affected an entire continent and contributed to cultural developments across Africa and beyond. Some researchers have suggested that human activities may have accelerated the environmental collapse. Overgrazing by the large livestock herds that pastoral communities had built up during the abundant periods could have damaged vegetation and reduced the landscape's ability to retain moisture. Clearing of forests for agriculture might have altered local climate patterns and reduced the atmospheric recycling that helped maintain regional rainfall. What the evidence shows most strongly is that orbital mechanics were in command, both bringing the green periods and taking them away. The Green Sahara had always been temporary, a gift of cosmic geometry that was inevitably withdrawn when Earth's relationship with the Sun shifted to favour different patterns of atmospheric circulation. Human activities might have influenced the timing or intensity of the collapse, but they didn't cause it. As the Sahara dried, it carved out the geographic boundaries and cultural patterns that underpinned later African history. The Sahara's transformation into an arid barrier separated North Africa from sub-Saharan regions, creating distinct cultural spheres that would develop along different trajectories for thousands of years. The concentration of populations along remaining rivers like the Nile contributed to the emergence of some of humanity's earliest complex civilizations. Still, even as the desert expanded and lakes dried, life didn't disappear entirely from the Sahara. Scattered oases maintained small populations of humans, animals, and plants that represented the last refugia of the Green Period. These isolated communities preserved fragments of the knowledge, traditions, and genetic diversity that had characterized the humid periods, maintaining connections across the desert through trade routes and cultural exchange that would eventually link the Mediterranean world with sub-Saharan Africa. The collapse of Eden wasn't complete. It was a transformation that created new possibilities even as it destroyed old certainties. The Sahara became a different kind of landscape, harsh and forbidding, but still capable of supporting human life and culture, for those who learned its rhythms and respected its limitations. Standing in the modern Sahara, surrounded by sand dunes that stretch to every horizon, it's almost impossible to imagine the green world that existed here just 5,000 years ago. But the evidence is everywhere if you know how to look, in the buried river channels that satellite radar reveals beneath the sand, in the fossil shorelines that mark the edges of vanished lakes, in the scattered artifacts and rock art that document the lives of people who witnessed one of the most dramatic environmental transformations in human history. Their world ended, but their legacy survived in the cultures that emerged from the Great Dispersal, in the knowledge systems that adapted to new environments, in the stories that preserved memories of abundance for generations who would know only scarcity. The collapse of the Green Sahara reminds us that even paradise is temporary, but it also demonstrates the remarkable resilience of human communities when faced with changes that seem impossible to survive. Deep beneath the Sahara, in places where no rain has fallen for thousands of years, groundwater still flows through ancient aquifer systems. The Nubian sandstone aquifer alone holds enough freshwater to cover the entire United States to a depth of 3 feet. This water fell as rain during the last green period, soaking into the ground and moving slowly through underground channels that connect regions separated by hundreds of miles of sand dunes. In a very real sense, the Green Sahara never completely disappeared, it just went underground, waiting. Satellite observations over the past 3 decades have detected something unexpected happening along the southern edge of the desert. Vegetation is increasing in areas that have been barren for centuries. Seasonal lakes are forming in depressions that haven't held water in living memory. Rainfall patterns across the Sahel show subtle but consistent changes that suggest the atmospheric circulation systems governing North African climate may be entering a new phase. Climate models based on orbital mechanics predict that the next major green period should begin in roughly 15,000 years, when Earth's axial precession once again aligns to pull monsoon rains deep into the continent. But some researchers are beginning to wonder whether that timeline might be accelerating. Current global climate changes are altering ocean temperatures and atmospheric circulation patterns in ways that could potentially trigger the return of green conditions much sooner than astronomical cycles alone would predict. The Mediterranean is warming faster than the global average, creating stronger thermal contrasts with the African interior. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the massive ocean current system that helps drive weather patterns across the North Atlantic, is showing signs of instability that could redirect moisture-bearing winds toward currently arid regions. Some climate models suggest these changes could begin affecting Saharan rainfall within centuries rather than millennia. But what would it actually look like if the Sahara started turning green again? The transition wouldn't happen overnight. Even during the fastest previous changes, the transformation took several centuries to complete. It would begin subtly, with slightly more reliable seasonal rains in the southern margins of the desert. Vegetation would slowly spread northward as soil conditions improved and seed banks that have waited in dormancy for thousands of years began to sprout. Findings point to the resilience of life, springing back to transform empty landscapes the moment circumstances allow. Seeds can remain viable in desert soils for extraordinary periods, waiting for the right combination of moisture and temperature to trigger germination. Migratory animals would gradually extend their ranges northward as water sources became more reliable and vegetation provided adequate food. Human communities would follow, first as temporary settlements around seasonal water sources, then as permanent communities as conditions continued to improve. The implications of a returning Green Sahara extend far beyond North Africa itself. Currently, dust from the Sahara fertilizes the Amazon rainforest, provides nutrients to Caribbean coral reefs, and affects global atmospheric chemistry. A Green Sahara would dramatically alter these systems, potentially changing precipitation patterns across South America and affecting ecosystems on multiple continents. The desert's role as a barrier between North and Sub-Saharan Africa would weaken, allowing increased movement of people, ideas, and species between regions that have been largely isolated for millennia. Should such a transformation start today, we would be able to witness and record it in ways unimaginable to past generations. Satellite monitoring systems can track vegetation changes in near real time, measure soil moisture across entire continents, and detect the early stages of ecosystem development long before they become visible to casual observation. We would be able to watch the return of life to the Sahara with a level of detail that no previous generation of humans could have imagined. No less remarkable are the lessons revealed through archaeology. The Green Sahara would expose sites that have been buried under sand dunes for thousands of years, revealing new evidence about the civilizations that flourished during previous humid periods. Ancient settlements, burial grounds, and rock art sites that are currently inaccessible beneath shifting sands would emerge as wind patterns change and vegetation stabilizes previously mobile dune systems. Ground-penetrating radar has already identified thousands of potential archaeological sites buried beneath the desert surface. Many of these locations show the distinctive signatures of human habitation, regular geometric patterns that suggest building foundations, concentrations of metal objects that might represent tool caches or ceremonial deposits, subsurface features that could be wells, storage pits, or burial chambers. The return of surface water would make many of these sites accessible for the first time in millennia. Imagine discovering intact settlements from the Green Sahara periods, preserved by arid conditions but suddenly exposed as environmental changes alter the landscape above them. The artifacts, structures, and human remains from these sites could revolutionize our understanding of early African civilizations and the relationship between environmental change and cultural development. But a returning Green Sahara would also create entirely new challenges for the modern world. Current national boundaries in North Africa were drawn with the assumption that much of the Sahara would remain uninhabitable wasteland. Territorial disputes that are currently irrelevant because they involve empty desert could suddenly become serious conflicts if those regions became valuable agricultural or pastoral land. Water rights would become a crucial issue as underground aquifers that have been stable for millennia began to recharge and discharge in new locations. Countries that currently have little reason to cooperate on water management would find themselves sharing river systems and lake basins that don't exist under current conditions, but could become major features of a Green Sahara landscape. The demographic implications are staggering to contemplate. The Green Sahara supported millions of people during previous humid periods, living in communities scattered across regions that are now completely uninhabitable. A modern Green Sahara with current population densities and agricultural techniques could potentially support tens of millions of people in areas that currently host only scattered nomadic groups and scientific research stations. Such population movements would reshape the entire African continent. Currently, the Sahara acts as a demographic barrier that limits migration between North and Sub-Saharan regions. A Green Sahara would create opportunities for movement and cultural exchange on scales not seen since the end of the last humid period 5,000 years ago. Genetics adds another layer to the story, one equally rich in intrigue. Populations that have been separated by desert barriers for millennia would have opportunities for renewed contact and intermixing. Languages that diverged when their speakers were forced apart by environmental changes could influence each other again. Cultural traditions that developed in isolation could merge and hybridize in ways that would create entirely new forms of human expression. From orbit, satellites sometimes reveal snapshots that echo the desert's greener past. After rare heavy rainfall events, temporary lakes form in low-lying areas, and dormant seeds sprout across landscapes that are normally completely barren. These brief transformations, lasting only weeks or months before the desert reasserts itself, provide tantalizing previews of what could happen if such conditions became permanent. The speed with which life returns to these temporarily watered areas is remarkable. Within days of adequate rainfall, areas that have been barren for years can become carpeted with green shoots. Birds appear seemingly from nowhere to take advantage of temporary insect populations. Mammals emerge from refugia where they have survived harsh conditions, quickly spreading across newly habitable terrain. These temporary greening events demonstrate that the biological potential for Saharan transformation still exists. The seeds are there, waiting in the soil. The genetic material for establishing new plant communities persists in scattered populations along the desert margins. The ecological knowledge for exploiting temporary resources remains embedded in the behavior of desert-adapted species. All that's missing is the sustained rainfall that would make such changes permanent rather than ephemeral. The question isn't whether the Sahara will turn green again. Orbital mechanics guarantee that it will eventually. The question is when, and whether human activities are accelerating, delaying, or fundamentally altering the natural cycles that have operated for millions of years. Some researchers suggest that current global warming could actually favour the return of green conditions by intensifying the thermal contrasts that drive monsoon systems. Others argue that human activities are disrupting atmospheric circulation patterns in ways that could prevent the natural cycles from operating as they have in the past. The truth likely involves complex interactions between natural cycles and human influences that we're only beginning to understand. What we do know is that the Sahara holds secrets that could fundamentally change our understanding of human history, environmental change, and the relationship between climate and civilization. Buried beneath the sand are cities, monuments, and artifacts from cultures that flourished when the desert was garden. Hidden in the rock formations are mineral and water resources that could support entirely new patterns of human settlement. Encoded in the sediments are climate records that could help us predict and prepare for environmental changes that will affect billions of people. The story of the Green Sahara reminds us that the landscapes we consider permanent are actually temporary arrangements, subject to forces that operate on scales beyond individual human experience, but still within the realm of historical possibility. It challenges us to think beyond the assumptions we make about our own environment, to consider what our descendants might find when they excavate the remains of our civilizations from beneath whatever landscapes replace the ones we know today. Standing at the edge of the Sahara as evening light turns the dunes gold and purple, it's possible to imagine the sounds that once filled this silence. Rivers flowing toward distant lakes, wind moving through forests that stretched beyond the horizon, voices of people whose lives were shaped by abundance rather than scarcity, whose dreams were not limited by the harsh realities of desert survival. That world will return someday. The same forces that created it continue to operate with the patience of planetary time. When it does return, it will inherit the legacy of all the previous green periods, the buried cities, the underground rivers, the sleeping seeds that have waited thousands of years for their moment to bloom again. The desert is not dead. It is only dreaming. And in its dreams, rivers flow where now there is only sand, forests grow where now there is only stone, and voices call across landscapes green with life and bright with possibility. The question is not whether these dreams will become reality again, but what stories will be told when they do, and who will be there to witness the moment when the Sahara remembers how to live. Thank you for watching.